The Zodiac killer terrorized Northern California in the late 1960s, taunted police with cryptic letters, and then vanished without a trace. For over 50 years, investigators, amateur sleuths, and obsessed researchers have pointed fingers at dozens of suspects. Some died in prison. Others lived quiet lives until their last breath. A few are still alive today, watching the accusations pile up. Here's what actually happened to every major Zodiac suspect, and why most of them probably weren't the killer at all. Starting with the man who confessed, Louis Joseph Myers. Louis Joseph Myers confessed to being the Zodiac killer on his deathbed in 2001, which should have been the biggest break in true crime history, except nobody believed him. Myers was a Navy veteran who lived in the Bay Area during the Zodiac murders. His friend Randy Kenny came forward after Myers died, claiming Louis had admitted everything to him years earlier. According to Kenny, Myers described details only the killer would know, expressed remorse for his crimes, and wanted to finally come clean before cancer took. The confession included specific information about victims and crime scenes that seemed too accurate to dismiss. But here's where it gets complicated. Myers never confessed directly. He only told Kenny, who waited until after his friend's death to report it. Investigators found zero physical evidence connecting Myers to any Zodiac crime. His handwriting didn't match the letters. His fingerprints didn't match the partial prints from the Zodiac correspondence. DNA testing on the stamps and envelopes from Zodiac letters excluded Myers entirely. The timeline worked geographically, but that's where the connections ended. Myers died of cirrhosis of the liver on May 4, 2001 in California. He was 72 years old. His confession remains one of the most controversial in Zodiac history because it came with just enough detail to seem credible, but not enough evidence to prove anything. Kenny insisted his friend was telling the truth, but without corroboration, Myers joined the long list of people who claimed to be the Zodiac without any proof. The case goes nowhere without evidence, which is exactly what investigators found with Myers. Zero. But at least Myers confessed voluntarily, unlike the next suspect, who was dragged into the investigation by his own children. Arthur Lee Allen. Arthur Lee Allen is the most famous Zodiac suspect in history, and he died in 1992 without ever being charged. Allen was a convicted child molester, a Navy veteran, and a Bay Area resident during the Zodiac murder. He owned the same rare caliber weapon used in some Zodiac attacks. He wore a Zodiac brand watch with the same crosshair symbol the killer used in his letter. Multiple witnesses, including friends and family, reported disturbing statements Allen made about wanting to kill people and taunt police. Don Chaney, Allen's friend, told police that Allen discussed plans for a killing spree and calling himself Zodiac months before the first confirmed murder. Investigators searched Allen's home multiple times. They found weapons, bombs, and disturbing materials, but nothing definitively linking him to the Zodiac crime. His handwriting didn't match. His fingerprints didn't match. His DNA, tested years after his death, didn't match samples from Zodiac letters. Survivor Michael Mageau, who was shot by the Zodiac at Blue Rock Springs, identified Allen in a photo lineup in 1991, but the identification came decades after the attack and was considered unreliable. Allen died of heart failure on August 26, 1992 in Vallejo, California. He was 58 years old. Hours after his death, investigators executed another search warrant at his home, finding more suspicious items, but still no smoking gun. The Vallejo Police Department named Allen as their prime suspect in 2010, but that designation came 18 years after his death and remains controversial among researchers. Robert Graysmith's book Zodiac heavily focused on Allen as the killer, and the 2007 David Fincher film portrayed him as the most likely suspect. But the physical evidence tells a different story. Every scientific test performed excluded Allen. His status as the prime suspect rests entirely on circumstantial behavior and witness statements, not forensic proof. Allen remains the suspect everyone recognizes, but the evidence says he wasn't the Zodiac, which makes the obsession with him even stranger when other suspects had far more compelling connection, like the man whose own son turned him in and spent decades trying to prove his father was a serial killer. Earl Van Best Jr. Earl Van Best Jr. was accused of being the Zodiac by his biological son, Gary Stewart, who published a book in 2014 making his case. Stewart was adopted as an infant and didn't learn his biological father's identity until adulthood. When he started researching Van Best's life, he found disturbing connections. Van Best lived in San Francisco during the Zodiac murder. He had a criminal record, including child abandonment and statutory rape. Stewart believed his father's handwriting matched the Zodiac letters, and he hired experts who agreed. He claimed his father's appearance matched the famous Zodiac composite sketch, and that his forehead creases perfectly aligned with creases visible in the sketch. But professional investigators disagreed completely. The San Francisco Police Department and FBI reviewed Stewart's claims and found them unconvincing. Van Best's fingerprints didn't match prints lifted from Zodiac letters. His DNA, obtained from items belonging to Van Best's relatives, didn't match DNA from Zodiac evidence. Handwriting analysis is notoriously subjective, and independent experts disputed Stewart's hired analysts. The composite sketch Stewart referenced was just one of several conflicting conflicting descriptions given by different witnesses, and sketch accuracy degrades significantly over time. Van Best died on August 21st, 1984, in Mexico. He was 48 years old. He lived most of his later life in poverty, estranged from his family, and never faced any charges related to the Zodiac investigation. Stewart's 2014 book, The Most Dangerous Animal of All, became a bestseller and was adapted into a documentary series, but the accusations remain entirely circumstantial. The tragedy here isn't just that Stewart genuinely believes his father was a serial killer. It's that he spent years of his life trying to prove something that forensic science has already disproved. Van Best wasn't the Zodiac, but his son's obsession keeps the accusation alive decades after his death. At least Van Best's accuser was his own son trying to find answers. The next suspect was accused by an entire community of online investigators who refused to let his name rest: Lawrence K. Kane. Lawrence Kane was a career criminal with brain damage from a 1962 car accident, and some researchers believe that accident triggered his transformation into the Zodiac killer. Kane lived in the Bay Area during all the confirmed Zodiac attacks. He worked at the same resort as Zodiac victim Donna Lass before she disappeared in 1970. He had a history of violence against women, including assault charges. After his car accident, Kane's personality allegedly changed dramatically, becoming more aggressive and erratic. He was terminated from his job at the same resort where Lass worked just before her disappearance, which some researchers see as a significant connection. Several circumstantial details make Kane interesting as a suspect. He supposedly resembled the Zodiac composite sketch. He lived near multiple crime scenes. Kathleen Johns, who claimed the Zodiac abducted her in 1970, later identified Kane as her attacker, though this identification came years after the incident, and its reliability is debated. Kane even appeared as a contestant on The Dating Game in 1978, which added a disturbing pop culture element to his story. But the evidence against Kane is thin. No physical evidence connects him to any Zodiac crime. His handwriting was examined and deemed inconclusive. He was never officially named a suspect by any law enforcement agency. The Donna Lass connection is circumstantial at best, and her case isn't even definitively linked to the Zodiac despite a letter claiming credit for her disappearance. Kane died on May 20th, 2010 in Nevada. He was 77 years old. He spent his later years living quietly, never charged with any Zodiac-related crime. Online communities continued debating his involvement, but no new evidence has emerged since his death to strengthen the case against him. Kane represents the problem with Zodiac suspect research. Geographic proximity and suspicious behavior get interpreted as guilt, but without physical evidence, it's just speculation. Which brings us to the suspect who perfectly fits the profile, but has been completely cleared by science: Rick Marshall. Rick Marshall was a San Francisco projectionist and organ player who became a suspect after Robert Graysmith included him in his Zodiac research. Marshall lived in San Francisco during the murders and had a history of bizarre behavior. He was obsessed with codes and ciphers, which aligns with the Zodiac's cryptographic letters. He allegedly made strange comments about the Zodiac case friend. Marshall's handwriting supposedly resembled the Zodiac's, and he owned similar boots to footprints found at the Lake Berryessa crime scene where Brian Hartnell and Cecilia Shepard were attacked. He also had a history of alcoholism and erratic behavior that some interpreted as signs of violent tendencies. Investigators looked into Marshall during the initial investigation and again in later decades. They found nothing concrete connecting him to any crime. His fingerprints didn't match. His handwriting analysis was inconclusive at best. The boot connection was meaningless since they were common work boots sold throughout California. Witnesses who saw the Zodiac at Lake Berryessa didn't identify Marshall when shown his photo. Marshall died on March 6, 1996 in California. He was 65 years old. He never faced any charges related to the Zodiac investigation, and after his death, no new evidence emerged linking him to the crimes. His inclusion in Zodiac research comes primarily from Graysmith's work, which has been criticized for focusing on suspects without sufficient evidence. The problem with Marshall as a suspect is that everything about him is second-hand information. Friends said he acted weird. Researchers said his handwriting looked similar, but nobody ever produced concrete evidence, and he died without anyone seriously pursuing him as a viable suspect. At least Marshall was investigated while alive. The next suspect wasn't publicly named until decades after he died, when genetic genealogy suddenly made him the internet's favorite answer: Gary Francis Post. Gary Francis Post became international news in October 2021 when a private investigation team called the Case Breakers announced he was the Zodiac killer. Post died in 2018, so he never responded to the accusation. The Case Breakers presented circumstantial evidence, including alleged photographic comparison between Post's facial features and the Zodiac composite sketch, forehead scars that supposedly matched, and claims that Post confessed to friends before his death. The group also suggested Post was responsible for the 1966 murder of Sherry Jo Bates in Riverside, which some researchers linked the Zodiac, despite official doubts about that connection. connection. The announcement made headlines worldwide and trended on social media for days. Then the FBI and local law enforcement agencies issued statements saying the case breaker's claims were unfounded and that Post was not a credible suspect. The group never provided any physical evidence connecting Post to Zodiac crime. They didn't have his DNA, fingerprints, or handwriting analyzed by official forensic experts. Their evidence consisted entirely of photo comparison, witness statements from people claiming Post confessed, and geographic connections that placed him in California during the 1960s and 1970s. Post died on August 23, 2018 in Groveland, California. He was 80 years old. Before the case breaker's announcement, he was never publicly mentioned as a Zodiac suspect. No law enforcement agency ever investigated him in connection to the case. His name appeared nowhere in official Zodiac files until private researchers began pushing their theory years after his death. The Post accusation represents everything wrong with modern true crime culture. A private group makes bombshell claims, generates massive publicity, then offers no credible evidence when challenged. Post's family had to deal with their deceased relative being called a serial killer based on nothing but speculation and photo analysis. The real Zodiac investigation gained nothing from the media search. At least Post's accusers claimed to have evidence, even if it was nonsense. The next suspect was named by law enforcement and had far more compelling connections to the crime. Ross Sullivan. Ross Sullivan worked as a library assistant at Riverside City College in 1966 when Sherry Jo Bates was murdered by. He remains one of the most compelling suspects for both that murder and the Zodiac. Sullivan matched witness descriptions from multiple Zodiac crime scenes. He was approximately 6 feet tall, heavy build, with a crew cut, which aligns with descriptions given by surviving victims and witnesses. He disappeared from his job at the Riverside Library shortly after Bates was murdered, and his whereabouts during that period remain unknown. Sullivan had a history of mental illness and was institutionalized multiple times. He also wore military-style boots similar to prints found at crime scene. Here's where it gets really interesting. Sullivan moved to San Francisco in 1969, right before the confirmed Zodiac murders began in the Bay Area. He lived within blocks of multiple crime scenes. He worked at a library again, giving him access to materials the Zodiac used for his letters and codes. Some researchers believe Sullivan's mental health issues and institutionalizations explain the Zodiac's sudden silence in the mid-1970s, theorizing he was hospitalized during that period. But Sullivan was never officially named a suspect during the original investigation. He was only seriously considered decades later when researchers began comparing his background to the crime timeline. His fingerprints and handwriting have never been officially compared to Zodiac evidence, though private researchers claim they found similarity. No physical evidence has ever been presented linking Sullivan to any Zodiac crime. Sullivan died on September 29, 1977 in Santa Cruz, California. He was 36 years old. The circumstances of his death aren't widely publicized, but he died relatively young, possibly due to health complications from his mental illness. He never faced questions about the Zodiac or Bates murders during his lifetime, and his potential involvement wasn't seriously discussed until researchers began investigating him posthumously. Ross Sullivan represents the suspect who actually fits the profile better than most others, but without official investigation during his lifetime and no physical evidence to examine now, he'll remain a compelling theory with no way to confirm or deny. Which brings us to the final suspect, the only one still alive today, watching the accusations and doing absolutely nothing to help clear his name: Paul Dorr. Paul Dorr is still alive, and he's been named as a Zodiac suspect multiple times over the past decade, which makes him fundamentally different from every other person on this list. Dorr lived in the Bay Area during the Zodiac murders and allegedly knew some of the victims. He supposedly resembled the composite sketches, particularly the famous sketch from the Paul Stine murder in San Francisco. Researchers have pointed to his military background, his presence in Northern California during all the murders, and alleged behavioral red flags as evidence of his involvement. Some investigators claim Dorr made suspicious statements about the Zodiac case over the years. But here's the problem with naming living suspects. You need actual evidence, and nobody has provided it. Dorr has never been officially named a suspect by any law enforcement agency. No physical evidence connects him to any Zodiac crime. His fingerprints and DNA haven't been officially compared to Zodiac evidence, or if they have, the results haven't been made public. The accusations against him come primarily from private researchers and internet sleuths, not professional investigators with access to case files and forensic evidence. Dorr is in his 80s now and living in Northern California. He hasn't been arrested or charged with any Zodiac-related crimes. He's given occasional interviews denying involvement, but he largely ignores the accusation. The obsessive online communities tracking his every move treat him like a confirmed killer, but law enforcement doesn't share their cert. The ethics of publicly naming living suspects without evidence is deeply questionable. If Dorr is innocent, which the complete absence of physical evidence suggests, then he's spent years being called a serial killer killer by strangers on the internet. If he's guilty, then private researchers have spent decades compromising a potential criminal case by publicizing their theories without coordination with official investigators. Dorr represents the final evolution of Zodiac suspect culture, living people accused by amateur detectives based on circumstantial connections, geographic proximity, and subjective photo comparisons, all while law enforcement says nothing to confirm or deny claim. The Zodiac killer is either dead like most of these suspects, or he's still alive watching everyone guess wrong. 8 major suspects, decades of investigation, and not a single one definitively proven to be the killer. Some died in prison for other crimes. Others lived quiet lives until their final day. A few were turned in by their own families, desperate for answers. And one is still alive, ignoring the accusation because there's no actual evidence connecting him to anything. That's the truth about Zodiac suspect. Everyone has a theory, but nobody has proof. If you enjoyed this video and want to see more, click the video on the screen now.